Psychiatrists of Reddit, have you ever had a patient that genuinely scared you? If so, why? I'm a psych PA now, but this is earlier in my career as a therapist. Had a guy with antisocial personality disorder on parole and said he genuinely wanted help. He wasn't appropriate for where I was at the time, so I just had him with me for about an hour, getting him set up with care elsewhere. He was very intelligent, well-spoken, and attractive. I kept my door open some because he was unsettling, and people kept asking me who he was for the next few days. He described some of his crimes to me, and it was very real catch-me-if-you-can kind of stuff. Check fraud, impersonating a doctor at a local hospital twice. His file corroborated his story. He was very pleasant and calm, and I had removed all personal items from my office. Nothing with my address, no pictures, etc. before I got him because we had a heads up. He spent most of the time making freakishly astute observations of me as a person and my life. You could definitely see how he was able to do what he did in terms of manipulating other people to take advantage of them. He was very cool and calm in describing his crimes. Give me all the psychosis, violent kids and adults you want. I've had a lot of what people would typically consider scary, and I don't mind it because you can sort through what has happened to that person and try to help them. But this guy was legitimately terrifying. I still get chills thinking about him. On the other side, I did have a young man once, tons of trauma in his HX, very violent with people and animals. I was always worried he was going to end up in the system. I ran into him last year. He's an adult, getting married with a kid on the way, working full-time and moving his family across the country to get away from negative influences at home. He remembered me and recognized me and even asked if he could give me a hug. I thought I accomplished nothing with him, and that experience makes me feel so full because he is going to have a good life, and maybe I played some small role in that. I was a paramedic and not a psychologist. We were called to a house for a fire. The parents were sobbing and holding a baby and a 7-year-old. No one looked injured, but we started checking everyone. But our captain directed us over to a squad car where an 11-year-old girl sat. I won't go into details, but she started the fire to get rid of the baby, her words. This was the third attempt to kill the baby, and she had already been institutionalized twice. She had tried this on the 7-year-old years ago as well, so they sent her to live with her grandparents for a bit. She was the most disturbed child I've ever met. She was so amused by her parent crying and her siblings sobbing, just giggling about it. But once she realized she was going to the psych ward again, it's like a switch flipped. She started begging her parents for help, then saying they had raped her, then saying they weren't her real parents and she didn't even live there. Something happened to that girl, but her story changed so much it was hard to figure out. We spent 2 hours at the scene, more than most scenes. My cousin works at the state psych facility, and she has come and gone a few more times before being sentenced by a judge to permanently reside there, now as an adult. I don't know what crime she committed, but it must have been bad. Also not a psychiatrist, but I worked in a facility for senior health, basically a medication adjustment unit for people 55 plus, mental health patients or psych ward. I worked overnights in my early 20s, and all of the lights are off except the nurse's station, so that alone was eerie. It was always 2 RNs and 1 CNA, me. I did 30-minute checks throughout the night, but we had one admin that had lost her marbles and was brought in by a Native American family with not a lot of hospital background or diagnosis information to even go off of. This 60-something-year-old Native American woman had bed sores so bad they tunneled through her buttocks, back, heels, everywhere from neglect. Babbled like a baby, saw things and reached for them when there was nothing there, scratched at herself, cackled at high volumes throughout the night, looked blankly into space, hawked snot into her hands then looked at it before sucking it back up. Just typing this, remembering seeing it, makes me want to puke. Was nonverbal, and you couldn't get her to understand almost anything. Anyway, after a few weeks, and the family never really taking her to the doctor, so we had to order lots of tests to see what's up, etc. Come to find out, this poor lady could have been normal if the family had just cared and taken care of her a lot sooner or brought her to the doctor. Syphilis had gone on so long inside of her, it pretty much destroyed her brain to the point of no return. She went crazy from a curable STI. Edit. Not so much scary, aside from randomly trying to hurt herself or cackling loudly at night, but it was sad how preventable it could have been, and who knows the care she received before she was brought to us. Neglect is heartbreaking. Not me, but my mom. She worked at an elementary school for some time that had a lot of very troubled kids. She dealt with bullied and abused kids every day, but there was one that had rattled her to her core. There was a young girl who lived with her grandmother. Her parents were no longer in the picture. She had obvious signs of schizophrenia, which the grandmother didn't fully understand or accept. My mom helped the girl the best she could, teaching her how to handle the voices in her head, and helped her through a few psychotic breaks. One day the girl comes in and explains the voices told her to kill the newborn puppies in the barn. She went into great detail, telling my mom how she killed the puppies and cleaned herself up. My mom didn't believe her until she called the grandmother, who stated very matter-of-factly, "Yep, she got to them." As far as I know, the girl never got treatment for the mental illness, even with my mom's insistence. My mom left, and I have no idea what happened to that girl. Not a psychiatrist, but a psych ward veteran. A girl came in with drug-induced psychosis after pulling a knife on her mother and rolling around on the shower floor with her tongue hanging out. She ran into my room in the middle of the night and just stared at me for a couple of minutes until the staff pulled her away. She tried to hide in my room too, because she thought they were going to kill her. She was followed by something called the redness, a man with red pools instead of eyes. I was woken up at night by the loudest scream I'd ever heard. It sounded like she was being killed. She'd seen him outside her window, such a nice girl, but she was constantly terrified, and it was heartbreaking. She made a full recovery in the end, and she's a really cool, happy person now. Another girl I knew came into the psychiatric intensive care unit, worst of the worst. She was really childish and obsessed with unicorns. There were scars from horrific self-harm on her, and in the middle of a conversation, she'd have some sort of switch and start madly banging her head on the nearest wall as hard as she could, then not remember it. I have no idea what happened to make her like that. The worst people in the child psych wards are the predators who sign up to just sexually abuse the patients. I've known a lot of them. Not a psychiatrist, but I worked nights in a mental health institute at one time, and would get sent on whichever unit didn't have enough staff. This one unit was entirely in the dark, except for the nursing station. It felt like we were in a locked aquarium because we were surrounded by glass to get a view on each of the lightless hallways. There was this one patient that would always crawl around. She wore a whole body padded up suit and helmet to allow her to move around freely without hurting herself. We could not communicate with her, but she moved around a lot, so we always kept an eye on her and tried to redirect her as needed. She was known to go around at night and get into other people's rooms, and when we didn't see her in time, we would hear some scream coming from a patient's room, and then we would run to get her out and bring her back to the hallways/her room. I still get uneasy remembering seeing her shape spastically crawling on the floor along the walls of these dark hallways. It wasn't that she would get aggressive or anything, but it was this sense of never being able to connect and communicate with her, even non-verbally. I fed her many times, and she moved constantly in her chair, and would know to open her mouth when the fork/spoon got close enough, but otherwise, I was never able to make any eye contact with her or have any feeling of human connection/interaction. And I think that's what made me uncomfortable, this perceived loss of humanity. We still always spoke to her and everything, but in my entire time there, I never felt that I connected with her in any significant way, not for lack of trying. One of my colleagues, let's call him Mike, told me once, while he was feeding her, she briefly snapped out of it and said, "Thank you, Mike," and then went back to her usual state. The thought of her still knowing how to speak and knowing our names, but being trapped in this constant inability to communicate was what scared me the most, I think. Psych NP? So another not, but. I have had two. One was my fault, in that the setup was not ideal. I did not realize until this guy was in my office that I was literally the only person in my hallway who never takes lunch. I always work through the lunch hour, and only after he became a bit scary did I realize how very alone I was. He is still currently a patient of mine, level 3 sex offender, and although he did not directly threaten me, he was psychotic enough that day I was afraid something could happen. It was the look in his eyes and how he was responding to me. He was highly sexually inappropriate, beyond his normal over-the-top comments. We made it through the half hour, and for a few visits after, I always had his case manager in the room with us. He's doing a bit better now, but when he gets into the meth, it's a while getting him back. The other was another case of meth. PT calls me quite upset, saying he really needs to see me that day and talk to me about something personal. I'm expecting him to come in and tell me he's having some sexual side effects with his meds, but instead, he tells me he's been buying an ADHD med on the street, and now he wants me to prescribe it. Naturally, I refused. I told him I could not do that, and he stormed out, yelling and making threatening comments. A week or two later, he told his therapist, co-worker of mine, all PTS I see have therapists or case managers, that he was going to slash my tires, that he had a knife, and he wanted to kill me. I don't work at a big hospital or anything, but rather a rural community health clinic, and only one day/week. It is not hard to figure out which car is mine, if you wanted to find out. I was pretty paranoid for a bit, thinking through scenarios about how I would fight this guy off. Psychiatrist here. Yes, but it's rare. The vast majority of times were very agitated patients that were extremely ill on an inpatient psych unit. None of them had the intention to harm me. None of them harmed me physically. The odds of being harmed are exponentially higher as a person with mental illness as compared to the odds of being harmed by someone with mental illness. I can't imagine the fear most hospitalized patients are feeling, stuck inside a disturbed mind on a locked unit. Every time I felt scared, it was brief, and followed by grief over how distressing it must be to experience that level of psychological distress. There was one person in the clinic that scared me, but, he was kinda just puffing out his chest and trying to flaunt. I haven't worked with antisocial patients much, with a few exceptions, but that is some scary shit.